Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody notices. Sometimes the man behind the wheel knows more about leadership than those who claim to lead. And sometimes, when the cameras roll and the truth comes out, silence becomes the loudest sound of all. The morning rush hour in downtown Dallas felt like any other Tuesday. Ray Washington adjusted his rearview mirror as passengers climbed aboard the Route 42 bus at Main Street Station. The coffee shop across the street was already packed with suits, grabbing their daily fix before heading to their office towers. Ray pulled the heavy lever to close the doors, the hydraulic hiss cutting through the urban morning symphony of honking cars and construction noise. He drove the same route every day for 6 months now, invisible to most riders who buried their faces in phones or stared out windows. Ray knew their patterns better than they knew themselves. The woman in seat 12 who always dropped her purse, the businessman who fell asleep between Commerce and Elm, the college kid who never had exact change. They looked through him like he was part of the machinery. "Driver!" a sharp voice cut from the back. "This air conditioning is freezing me out back here. Turn it down!" The blonde woman in the business suit didn't bother to look up from her phone as she barked the order. Ray glanced in the mirror and saw her perfectly manicured finger pointing at the vent above her seat. He reached for the climate control without a word. As he adjusted the temperature, Ray's eyes caught the small photo tucked into the corner of his sun visor, a faded picture of him in dress blues, shaking hands with a general. The metal ribbon was barely visible in the creased image, but Ray could still feel its weight on his chest from that ceremony 3 years ago. He'd kept the photo there as a reminder, though he wasn't sure of what anymore. Every morning at 7:23 a.m., Ray would pass the same homeless veteran sitting outside the Wells Fargo building. Today, like every day, he slowed the bus just enough to catch the man's eye and give him a small nod. It was their ritual, two former soldiers acknowledging each other across the divide of circumstance. The gesture lasted 3 seconds, but it anchored Ray's day. "Hey, what's the holdup?" The businessman in seat 6 tapped his Rolex against the window. "Some of us have real jobs to get to." He laughed at his own joke, loud enough for everyone to hear. The man wore a $2,000 suit and carried himself like he owned the city. His name was Derek Morrison, and he treated every service worker like they were beneath his notice. Ray noticed an elderly woman struggling with her walker as she approached the bus stop. Without being asked, he activated the wheelchair lift and helped her secure her walker in the designated space. She squeezed his hand and whispered, "Thank you, dear." It was the only genuine human contact he'd had all morning. A teenage girl in the middle of the bus looked up from her phone and watched Ray help the elderly woman. She'd been riding this route for weeks, and she'd never seen any other driver go out of their way like that. "That was really nice," she said quietly. Ray met her eyes in the mirror for just a moment and nodded. The simple acknowledgement felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Ray felt something shift in his chest, a flutter of hope he quickly suppressed. He'd learned not to expect recognition or respect in this job. He was just the guy who drove the bus, invisible labor that kept the city moving. The feeling passed as quickly as it came, and he settled back into the familiar rhythm of stops and starts, the mechanical ballet of urban transportation. The day ended like it began, with Ray parking the bus in the depot and walking to his beat-up Honda Civic. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, watching other drivers head home to their families. Tomorrow would be the same route, the same faces, the same invisibility. But something felt different now, like a door had cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. The next morning, Ray's supervisor, Frank, pulled him aside in the break room. "Morrison called about you," Frank said, not looking up from his clipboard. Ray's stomach tightened. Derek Morrison was the kind of man who could make problems disappear, or create them. "He wants you on his regular route." Frank's tone was neutral, giving nothing away about whether this was good news or bad. Ray stared at his reflection in the break room's grimy microwave. Why would someone like Morrison specifically request him? He wasn't the fastest driver or the most talkative. He just did his job and tried to treat people with dignity. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe he'd been too visible, too human. The other drivers gathered around the coffee machine, their voices carrying across the small room. "Ray's getting special treatment," one of them said with a sneer. "Wonder what he had to do for that." The laughter that followed felt like nails on a chalkboard. Ray had heard variations of this his whole life, the assumption that any success must be unearned, any recognition must be suspicious. Ray's mind drifted to his father's funeral 2 years ago. Mayor Washington had been a giant in Houston politics, a man who'd fought segregation and built bridges between communities. At the service, person after person had stood up to tell stories about how the mayor had changed their lives. Ray had listened from the front pew, wondering if he'd ever make that kind of difference. A new driver named Marcus approached Ray's locker. The kid was fresh out of training, still eager and optimistic. "Hey, I heard what you did for that old lady yesterday," Marcus said. "My grandmother always said you can tell a lot about a person by how they treat folks who can't do nothing for them." Ray nodded but said nothing. The kid's words lodged somewhere deep in his chest. That afternoon, a family of tourists climbed aboard, parents and two young children, clearly lost and overwhelmed by the big city. They spoke broken English and fumbled with their phones trying to figure out where to go. Without being asked, Ray pulled over and spent 5 minutes helping them understand the bus system, drawing a simple map on the back of a transfer slip. The father shook his hand with tears in his eyes. Derek Morrison witnessed the whole exchange from his usual seat. His face darkened as he watched Ray spend extra time with people who clearly weren't from around here. "We paying you to be a tour guide now?" Morrison called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some of us got appointments to keep." The bus fell silent except for the rumble of the engine. Ray looked in the rearview mirror and saw his own eyes staring back, tired but steady. He could feel every passenger waiting to see how he'd respond. The silence stretched like a held breath. Part of him wanted to explain, to defend himself, to make Morrison understand. But he'd learned long ago that some battles couldn't be won with words. The local news crew was setting up at the next stop when Ray pulled the bus over. He couldn't see what the commotion was about, but there were cameras and microphones in a crowd gathering on the sidewalk. He thought about pulling away, finding an alternate route. Media attention was the last thing he needed right now. As the bus emptied, Ray sat behind the wheel in perfect stillness. The photo on his visor caught the afternoon light, that young soldier receiving recognition he'd earned with blood and courage. The silence in the empty bus was complete, broken only by the tick of cooling metal. For a moment, Ray let himself remember what it felt like to be seen. A woman in a sharp suit approached the bus. Ray recognized her as Channel 8's investigative reporter. Behind her, a tall man in an expensive coat was walking toward the bus, flanked by what looked like city officials. Ray's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Something was happening, something he didn't understand. The first passengers to reboard looked at Ray differently now, their faces uncertain. Derek Morrison was notably absent. The elderly woman with the walker that Ray had helped days earlier smiled at him as she took her seat. "I know who you are now," she whispered. "I called the TV station. People should know." "Ladies and gentlemen," the reporter's voice carried from outside the bus, "we're here to honor someone who's been serving this community in ways most people never knew." Ray felt the words hit him like physical blows. This wasn't what he wanted. He'd never wanted the spotlight, never wanted to be anyone's symbol or story. Ray was offered a microphone, but he shook his head. The mayor of Dallas stepped forward instead, holding up the commendation letter that Ray thought no one would ever see. "This man saved 17 people during Hurricane Harvey," the mayor announced. "And for the past 6 months he's been riding our buses, experiencing our public transportation system firsthand, preparing a report on how to serve our citizens better." Derek Morrison stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and drawn. The businessman who'd treated Ray like dirt now understood exactly who he'd been insulting. Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the pavement. Several other passengers from the morning route shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own casual cruelties. "I don't want your job," Ray finally spoke, his voice carrying easily across the crowd. "I want to finish mine." He gestured toward the bus, toward the route that still needed completing. "These people still need to get where they're going." The simplicity of the statement somehow made it more powerful than any speech. Within hours, the video was everywhere: social media, national news, talk shows. But more than that, Ray noticed changes on his route. Passengers said good morning now. They looked him in the eye. Derek Morrison had requested a different bus route entirely. Marcus, the young driver, started helping elderly passengers with their bags. Other drivers began taking extra moments with confused tourists. The small acts of kindness spread through the transit system like ripples in a pond, each gesture creating new ones. 3 months later, Ray sat in the same break room, drinking coffee from the same chipped mug. But the photo on his locker had changed. Now it showed him with the elderly woman who'd called the news station, both of them smiling beside his bus. The Route 42 had become known as the Dignity Route, where drivers were expected to see passengers as human beings first. "Service isn't about the uniform you wear," Ray said to Marcus, who was about to start his first solo route. "It's about the person you choose to be when nobody's watching." The young man nodded, understanding that he'd just received the most important training of his career. The morning rush hour in downtown Dallas felt different now. Ray still drove the same route, still helped the same passengers, still gave that small nod to the veteran outside Wells Fargo. But now he drove in full view of a city that had learned to see him. The invisible had become unforgettable, not through revelation, but through the quiet power of choosing dignity over indifference every single day.